Your Bibles, if you would, turn to Matthew chapter 21. We're going to continue looking at Matthew's gospel, and so we're going to look at a interesting story today, a familiar one, but one that can easily be misunderstood. Matthew 21, it's the passage that Lucian read a little bit earlier. Jesus made a very interesting statement regarding the things that he said and did while he lived here on this earth. It's recorded in John's gospel. He said this, "I only do what my Father tells me to do. I only say what my Father tells me to say." I want you to think about that for a second. Because if that's true, it would mean that Jesus was never reactive or impulsive in the things he said or did, because God directed him to say and do every one of those things. It means that everything he said and did was choreographed by an infinitely wise and sovereign God. Therefore, everything he did was thoughtful, deliberate, and purposeful. Every word was said and every deed was done in order to make a point, or teach a lesson, or to reveal something about the character or the will of God. Keep that in mind as we read the following story, which took place on Monday and Tuesday mornings during Holy Week, just a few days before Jesus was crucified. Verse 18, Matthew 21. In the morning, as he was returning to the city, Jesus became hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered at once. This seemingly random story has puzzled Bible students for centuries, and I think you know why. One could easily read this and conclude that Jesus was hungry, wanted to eat some fresh figs, and when he did not find any on a leafy fig tree, he got mad, cursed the tree, and killed it, which would suggest that Jesus lost his temper. That he reacted rashly, selfishly, cruelly even, because the tree did not meet his needs or expectations. And that conclusion would lead us to wonder about the sinlessness of our Savior, which has tremendous implications for our salvation. But there is another explanation, especially if you consider that Jesus never acted independently of his Father, but only said and did what his Father told him to say and do. Before we explore the meaning and significance of this story, you should know that this incident is also recorded in Mark's gospel, who reveals that it happened in two stages over a 2-day period, Monday and Tuesday morning. Now, this may seem like it contradicts Matthew's account, especially because Matthew tells us that the tree withered, quote, at once, which makes it seem like the tree shriveled in seconds right before their eyes. At once, however, can also be translated quickly. And by the way, a tree withering in a 24-hour period would certainly qualify as quickly from horticultural standards. In our exposition of the Gospel of Matthew, you might have figured out by now that Matthew is not particularly interested in giving his readers a precise chronological narrative of Jesus' life and ministry. Instead, he is primarily concerned about the messianic implications of the things Jesus said and did. And often he abbreviates or omits details or combines two or more conversations or interactions into one. And that's what he's doing here. So without contradicting Mark, Matthew tells the story of the fig tree, which happened over a 2-day period, all at once, keeping the focus on Jesus entering Jerusalem as the judging Messiah. That's his purpose. Thus, the initial encounter with the unfortunate fig tree happened on Monday morning, after the triumphal entry on Sunday and just before Jesus went to cleanse the temple, which we talked about last week. Matthew notes that Jesus became hungry, which has suggested to many that he looked to the fig tree to satisfy his hunger and that he expected to find fruit. Yet Mark notes in his account that it was not yet the season for figs. So, either Jesus was really mixed up, or his subsequent curse of this fig tree has to stem from some reason other than the tree's failure to bear fruit through no fault of its own. Don't forget, Jesus created fig trees. He knows the seasons and when trees bear fruit and when they don't. So what is the significance of this event? Jesus is returning to Jerusalem the morning after the triumphal entry. The path on which he and his disciples are walking traverses down the Mount of Olives to the Kidron Valley and up the other side to Mount Zion, where the temple is located. As they are walking, they have a full panoramic view of the city, but even closer to them than the whole city is the temple. And they can see the hustle and bustle in that temple during this Passover festival. They can see the crowded bazaar and the Gentile court where Jesus was heading. They can see the priests and their sacrificing of animals. They can see the smoke rising from the altars on which they are being sacrificed. That temple is Jesus' destination on this Monday morning. And as I informed you last week, he is deliberately going there to fulfill prophecy, to establish his authority, and to defend his Father's honor. And as Jesus is descending the Mount of Olives with this temple in full view, I can imagine him thinking about the history of this glorious house of God and all that God had accomplished in the lives of his people in that place. At the same time, Jesus had to be conscious of the fact that in just a few days, he would single-handedly render this temple and all of its operations obsolete. By his death, which would be the once-for-all sacrifice for sins, he would make animal sacrifices no longer necessary. During his death, the thick curtain in the temple, in the Holy of Holies that was designed to separate God, a holy God from sinful man, would tear from top to bottom, allowing anyone who believes in Jesus to come into his presence at any time, 24/7, not just the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement. And yet on this day, Jesus could see all of those people in that temple from a distance, going through the motions, happily performing their religious duties, conducting their temple business, convinced that these temple procedures and protocols would continue forever. All of them oblivious to what Jesus was about to do, and how it would affect their relationship with God and the temple. Most of them who would stubbornly cling to their temple traditions, unwilling to accept this radical change that Jesus would implement, unwilling to accept the new covenant, this completely different way of relating to God. Listen, I don't believe you can understand the incident about Jesus cursing the fig tree without understanding Jesus' anticipation of how the Jews would reject him as the fulfillment of God's plan of salvation and as their deliverer, and instead choose to cling to what would become a hollow, meaningless, empty tradition in less than a week's time. There is evidence in Scripture to suggest that Jesus was heartbroken all week during Holy Week over the people that he had come to save, but who had or would reject him. Just a couple of days from now, Jesus would stand on the Mount of Olives and look at Jerusalem and tearfully cry out, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." And so Jesus' encounter with this fig tree alongside the path should be understood as an acted parable. An acted parable. An acted parable is similar to an object lesson. An acted parable there were many of them that the prophets in the Old Testament did. Hosea is a good example. To illustrate, they would perform an act to illustrate a greater reality. And so it has a similar, if not identical, meaning to a parable that Jesus told, which is recorded in Luke's gospel. Verse 6 of chapter 13, and Jesus told this parable: a man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. And he said to the vine dresser, "Look, for 3 years I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and I find none. Cut it down. Why should it use up the ground?" Don't forget, in the ancient world, fruit trees were never ornamental. They were planted and used for food. And if a fruit tree did not bear fruit, it was good for nothing but firewood. Likewise, God's people are designed to bear spiritual fruit. Spiritual fruit refers to the beliefs, attitudes, character, behavior that corresponds to God's will and God's character. So people who truly belong to God will resemble God. They'll be on the same page as God. They will, to some degree, understand and do His will. They will follow His leadership. They will resemble His character. And if they do not, it proves they don't truly belong to Him, and therefore will in the end be cursed and condemned, just like a barren fig tree that was cursed and consigned to the woodpile. Spiritual fruitfulness, says Jesus, is the ultimate test of whether someone truly belongs to God. When Jesus cursed the fig tree because it was unfruitful and then it withered, He was illustrating that outward appearances can be misleading. A leafy fig tree in springtime gives the appearance that it bears fruit, but a closer inspection proves otherwise. Likewise, people may appear from their words and actions to belong to God. They show up at His house, they give Him lip service. They participate in His festivities and lend their voices in worship. They may read His words and even follow His commands. But as Jeremiah and Isaiah prophesied, their hearts are far from Him. For all practical purposes, the God who wants to be known is a stranger to them. And unfortunately for them, their destiny will be like that of the fig tree. They will perish. Now, I'm not sure, in fact, I rather doubt that this meaning sunk into the disciples at this moment here. On Monday morning, Mark is careful to let his readers know that the disciples heard Jesus curse the fig tree. And 24 hours later, while again on their way to Jerusalem, they passed by the fig tree, and verse 20, when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" At this point, the disciples have not interpreted Jesus' act as an acted parable. They are not contemplating the significance of spiritual fruitlessness. They are simply and naturally focused on the rapid demise of the fig tree. Oh, they had seen, believe me, they'd seen plenty of diseased fruit trees in their lives, but they hadn't seen one wither overnight. And so they were naturally astonished. Now, my translation, the ESV, suggests that in their astonishment, they asked a question of Jesus. How did this fig tree wither so quickly? That is a possible interpretation. But the grammar in the Greek text, remember, there's no punctuation, there's no question marks. The grammar in the Greek text could also lead one to interpret their remark not as a question, but as an exclamation. Oh, wow, look how that fig tree withered so quickly. And I think that interpretation makes more sense in light of Mark's account, in which he says that Peter, speaking for the disciples, said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." An exclamation, not a question. Well, without explaining the parable, without telling them why he cursed the fig tree, Jesus responds to the disciples' surprise and exclamation. Verse 21. He answered them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith." It might seem the simplest and most natural way to interpret this passage, verse 21 and 22, would be to conclude that Jesus was responding to the disciples' question of how this fig tree withered so quickly. And so he was responding to them, and he changed the subject from judgment to prayer. I want to submit to you that is not generally or typically how Jesus carried on a conversation. He didn't change subjects at the whim of his audience. He stayed on subject to make the point. Nor is it typical of Matthew's style of writing, who wanted to focus on the messianic implications. So it seems much more likely that Jesus was making a connection between the significance of the cursed fig tree and the power of the disciples' prayer. And so I believe that the kind of prayer he is talking about here is more focused and more specific than a general prayer, a teaching about prayer that says you can pray about anything and then you can expect to receive it if you have faith. I believe Jesus' promise to the disciples here is foreshadowing a very important role that they would soon have. Let me explain. Jesus here is essentially telling his disciples that what he has just done, they also would do if they have faith and do not doubt. What did Jesus just do? Yes, I know he cursed the fig tree and caused it to wither. I know that. But that was only symbolic. Remember, it's an acted parable. What he really did by doing that was prophesy. He was warning of judgment to those who only appear to belong to God, but in actuality do not belong to God because they don't bear spiritual fruit. And so what Jesus just did, namely produce dramatic, miraculous, symbolic, prophetic acts warning of judgment, the disciples will also do if they have faith and do not doubt. You may remember that earlier in Matthew's gospel, Jesus had come down from the Mount of Transfiguration with Peter, James, and John. He encountered his other 9 disciples trying to exorcise demons from a boy, but they couldn't. And they were frustrated. And they said to Jesus, "Why were we not able to exorcise the demons after Jesus did it?" And he told them that they were unable to do it because of what? their little faith. And then he said, for truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. So in that context, the moving of the mountain is an image of doing something humanly impossible in the normal course of events. That passage really is. In Matthew 21, however, throwing this mountain into the sea seems to be linked with the withering of the fig tree. So what's that connection? Probably the first thing we need to discern is what Jesus meant by this mountain. And what was it about this mountain that is related to judgment, represented by the cursed fig tree? Well, it would be natural, given the context, given the fact that they were descending the Mount of Olives at that time, to understand this mountain as the Mount of Olives, upon which Jesus and his disciples were standing. And it certainly would not have been lost on Jesus that there was an Old Testament prophecy about the removal of the Mount of Olives in front of Jerusalem. Zechariah states, on that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the other half southward, and you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azal, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Stay with me. I know this is getting a bit complex. Stay with me here. What Zechariah is describing here is the leveling of the area in front of Jerusalem, particularly on the east side of Jerusalem where the Mount of Olives came down and then went up through the east gate there. The reason for this leveling in Zechariah is to open up an escape route from Jerusalem while it is under attack from its enemies. In other words, the removing the mountain, the Mount of Olives, is God's provision for a way of escape from death and destruction. And so I believe Jesus is interpreting that prophecy in an eschatological way. That's a big word for meaning at the end of time, on the day of judgment, there will be an escape route. And also that he's interpreting the removal of the Mount of Olives as a symbol that foreshadows salvation. Just a couple of days after Jesus spoke these words, he was sitting on the Mount of Olives and predicted that a time would come when Jerusalem would come under attack and the very temple they were looking at would be destroyed. And it happened. But he also described a time when Jerusalem's inhabitants would need to flee because of the tribulation in that city. In that same discourse, Jesus portrays the grand and glorious arrival of the Son of Man, which is a reference to himself, which is similar to how Zechariah describes the coming of God with his holy ones in verse 5. We're going to get to that in Matthew 24. If Jesus had Zechariah's prophecy in mind when using the imagery of disposing of the Mount of Olives, there does still remain the question of what this might mean for the disciples. Do they remove the mountain by praying for the end time coming of the Son of Man to make things right? Do they metaphorically remove the mountain by proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and thus opening up for people that way of escape from the judgment of God before the end of time? We cannot be sure exactly, but perhaps it's both. Perhaps it includes something else. But in one way or another, through the exercise of faith, the disciples will contribute miraculously, not only in their proclamation of judgment, just like Peter did in Acts chapter 2 after the Holy Spirit came on them, but also in the salvation that represents the culmination of God's purposes. In whatever way the disciples are to contribute, the importance of the coming of the kingdom of heaven links very closely with what Zechariah prophesied just a few verses later. In verse 9, he says, "And the Lord will be king over all the earth." That's the purpose for removing the Mount of Olives. That is ultimately the message of Matthew's gospel. Okay, I know how complicated this is. I know it seems a bit fanciful here, but I think it makes the best sense in light of all that was happening and about to happen during Holy Week. Matthew has already emphasized in both the triumphal entry and in the cleansing of the temple that Jesus was fulfilling messianic prophecy, something that was extremely important to his Jewish audience. But it seems logical as well to assume that Jesus was also fulfilling prophecy in this event. And I don't think just from Zechariah. Listen to these other two passages that Jesus certainly would have been familiar with, and so would Matthew's audience. Micah 7:1. "What misery is mine? I am like one who gathers summer fruit at the gleaning of the vineyard. There is no cluster of grapes to eat, and none of the early figs that I crave." Could this have been a prophecy about Messiah's experience of coming to his own people, the Jews, but his own receiving him not? John 1:11. And then there is Jeremiah's prophecy. "I will take away their harvest, declares the Lord. There will be no grapes on the vine. There will be no figs on the tree." Listen to this. "And their leaves will wither. What I have given them will be taken from them." Again, in the context of God's judgment of Israel for rejecting his provision for their salvation, Jesus, it makes a lot of sense. And it also makes a lot of sense that Jesus here was foreshadowing the disciples' very important role that would soon be thrust upon them. He'd been preparing and equipping them for this role. Remember, he'd already promised to give them the keys to the kingdom so that whatever they bound on earth would be bound in heaven, whatever they loosed on earth would be loosed in heaven. Let me close. As I began studying this passage on Monday morning, I admit I was a bit confused and dismayed. I try very hard to be objective, to be honest in my study and my exegesis of a passage. I found myself writing down a number of questions that raised some yellow, if not red, flags in my mind. And if I didn't know Jesus better, I could have easily concluded that Jesus just got angry at the fig tree because it failed to satisfy his hunger. Or that he abused his power by cursing and condemning the fig tree. And then when I learned from Mark's gospel that this was not the season for figs, it was even more troubling because I thought of some of you farmers. And I thought how you would project and say, how can I trust a person? How can I put my faith in a person who doesn't even know when fruit gets ripe? When I learned, however, the things that I just shared with you, that this is an acted parable, that Jesus was describing how people can know for sure that they truly belong to God, it's by bearing fruit, and that he was foreshadowing a very important role for his disciples, I must tell you, I'm endeared to Jesus even more. To know that everything he did was deliberate. It had a purpose. To know that everything he did was for the good of the people that he came to save. And that even that curse, when you carry it out, when he talks about the mount being removed, it's about ultimately his love for people. He would go ahead and die on a cross even though he knew he would be rejected. It's ultimately about his love. And it magnified his love in my mind. It made me all the more grateful for his word that reveals these nuggets of truth. And I will just say, it made me all the more eager to see his face. To him be the power, the glory, forever and ever.